This is your final warning. Talk to us in that tone and get fired.
Little black girl issues final warning to racist flight attendant. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, an 8-year-old girl stood in the aisle of a first-class cabin, her small frame casting a long shadow under the overhead lights. Her voice cut through the murmur of shocked passengers with a clarity that belied her age. "This is your last chance to apologize. My father doesn't tolerate disrespect." The flight attendant standing before her, a woman who had spent 18 years perfecting her professional smile, let out a scoff that dripped with condescension. Around them, passengers gasped, some leaning forward in their seats, others pulling out their phones. The little girl didn't flinch. She simply waited, her dark eyes steady and unwavering. What this flight attendant didn't know would change her life forever. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 6 hours to where this journey began. Lagos International Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos of international travel. Among the throngs of passengers wheeling luggage and checking tickets, one small figure moved with remarkable composure. Zahra Okonkwo was 8 years old, but something about the way she carried herself suggested an old soul living in a young body. Her natural hair had been styled into intricate braids, each one adorned with small gold beads that caught the fluorescent light and chimed softly when she moved. She wore a simple purple dress, her favorite color, and on her back, a small backpack covered in airplane pins from destinations around the world. Zahra was traveling alone today. An unaccompanied minor on an 11-hour journey from Lagos to New York's JFK Airport. For most 8-year-olds this would be terrifying. For Zahra, it was just another trip to visit her grandmother in Brooklyn. But Zahra Okonkwo wasn't most 8-year-olds. Her father, Chukwuemeka Okonkwo, stood beside her at the check-in counter, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. To the casual observer, he looked like any other father sending his daughter off on a trip. Tall, with close-cropped hair beginning to gray at the temples, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of success without screaming wealth. But Chukwuemeka Okonkwo was the CEO of Okonkwo Petroleum Industries, one of Africa's largest oil companies. His net worth sat comfortably at $4.2 billion. His company supplied fuel to airlines, shipping companies, and industrial operations across 3 continents. And yet, as he knelt down to look his daughter in the eye, all of that melted away. He was just a father saying goodbye to his little girl. "You have everything you need?" he asked, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "Yes, Daddy," Zahra replied, her voice soft but confident. "Your grandmother will pick you up at arrivals. The airline staff will stay with you the entire time." He paused, studying her face. "You know you can call me anytime. The phone has satellite connection. Even over the ocean." "I know." Chukwuemeka's expression grew serious. He cupped her face in his hands, those large hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts and shook hands with presidents, now cradling his daughter's cheeks with infinite gentleness. "Zahra, listen to me. Remember who you are. Always. You are brilliant. You are worthy. You are deserving of respect." His voice dropped lower. "Never let anyone make you small." Zahra had heard these words before. Her father had been repeating them since she was old enough to understand. Ever since her mother had died 3 years ago, when Zahra was just 5, he had taken on both parental roles with fierce dedication. He didn't just raise her, he fortified her. Taught her that dignity was not negotiable. That respect was not something to beg for, but something to expect. "I won't, Daddy," Zahra promised, and she meant it. They hugged one more time before an airline representative, a kind-looking woman with a bright smile, came to escort Zahra through security. Chukwuemeka watched his daughter disappear into the crowd, that small backpack bouncing with each step, and felt the familiar ache of letting her go. But he also felt pride. His daughter was wise beyond her years, observant in ways that sometimes startled him. She noticed things others missed. She asked questions that cut to the heart of matters. She was polite always but never submissive. She was going to change the world someday. He was certain of it. What Chukwuemeka couldn't have known was that today, on Flight T-7834, his 8-year-old daughter would change at least one person's world entirely. While Zahra made her way through the airport, someone else was preparing for the same flight. Veronica Hawthorn stood in the crew-ready room, checking her appearance in the mirror with the practiced eye of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. At 42 years old, Veronica had been with Transcontinental Airways for 18 years, a tenure she wore like a badge of honor. Her blonde hair sat in a tight bun without a single strand out of place. Her makeup was precise, her uniform crisp. Sharp features gave her face an austere quality that some passengers found intimidating. She preferred to think of it as professional. Veronica had worked hard to get where she was. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, she hadn't come from money. She'd started in economy class, dealing with crying babies and demanding passengers in cramped quarters. Over the years, she'd climbed her way up to first class, where passengers were supposedly more refined, more appreciative of proper service. This was her domain now, and she ran it according to her standards. High standards, she told herself. That's what separated first class from the rest. Veronica lived alone in a modest apartment with her 2 cats, Mr. Whiskers and Lady Grey. Her marriage had ended 7 years ago, an amicable divorce or so she told people, though the truth was more complicated. No children. Few close friends. The airline was her life, her identity. Being a senior first-class flight attendant meant something to her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. What she could articulate quite clearly were her opinions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. There had been complaints, of course. 47 of them over the years to be exact. Passengers claiming she treated them differently, questioned their tickets too aggressively, made assumptions about their ability to afford premium seating. But Veronica had always managed to deflect these complaints. She'd explained that she was simply being thorough, maintaining security, following protocol. Her supervisors, overwhelmed with their own responsibilities, usually accepted her explanations. After all, she'd been there 18 years. She must know what she's doing. Her prejudices weren't overt. Veronica would have been horrified to be called racist. She thought of herself as someone who simply recognized patterns, maintained standards. She wrapped her biases in the language of professionalism, which made them easier to justify, easier to hide even from herself. She believed, deep in a place she never examined too closely, that certain passengers simply didn't belong in first class. Today she would learn exactly how wrong she was. Flight 7834 sat at Gate B17, a Boeing 777 gleaming in the Lagos afternoon sun. The first-class cabin held 16 seats arranged in a 222 configuration, each one a small pod of luxury with lie-flat capabilities, personal entertainment systems, and enough legroom to stretch out fully. The boarding process was about to begin, and Veronica took her position near the entrance, ready to greet her passengers with the smile she'd perfected over 18 years, warm enough to seem genuine, professional enough to maintain distance. The first to board was Gerald Pemberton, a 65-year-old American executive with silver hair and the confident gait of someone who'd been flying first class for decades. He wore an expensive watch and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pemberton," Veronica said warmly, recognizing him from previous flights. "Wonderful to have you with us again. You're in seat 1A today." "Thank you, Veronica," Gerald replied, not breaking stride as he headed to his seat. She hadn't asked to see his boarding pass. Didn't need to. She knew he belonged there. Next came Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a slightly nervous smile. Tourist class, Veronica guessed, upgraded as a treat. Yuki clutched her boarding pass like a golden ticket. "Welcome aboard," Veronica said politely, her warmth noticeably cooler. "Seat 4B is on your left." Yuki nodded gratefully and found her seat without issue. Then Kofi Mensah appeared in the doorway. A Ghanaian businessman in his 50s, he wore a well-tailored suit and carried a slim portfolio of documents. His presence was distinguished, professional. He'd been making this route monthly for the past 5 years, building business connections between West Africa and North America. Veronica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" Kofi, accustomed to this routine, handed it over without comment. Veronica studied it longer than necessary, her eyes flicking between the pass and Kofi's face. "Seat 2A, she finally said, handing it back. "That's up here on the right." "Thank you," Kofi replied evenly, taking his seat. But Veronica wasn't done. She followed him down the aisle. "Sir, are you certain this is your seat? Economy boarding will begin shortly. Those seats are towards the back of the aircraft." Kofi turned, a flicker of frustration crossing his features before he smoothed it away. He'd dealt with this before. Too many times. "Yes, I'm certain. I fly this route monthly. This is my seat." Veronica's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course. Just checking." She returned to her position, but not before Kofi caught the doubt lingering in her eyes. Minutes later, another couple appeared. Aisha and Ibrahim Diallo, Nigerian newlyweds, both glowing with the special radiance of people deeply in love. Aisha wore a beautiful Ankara dress in vibrant blues and golds, her head wrap adding another 6 inches to her height. Ibrahim held her hand tightly, both of them barely containing their excitement. This was their first time in first class, a splurge for their honeymoon trip to New York. "Boarding passes, please," Veronica said, her professional mask firmly in place. They handed them over, beaming. But as Veronica examined Ibrahim's pass, she frowned. There was a small printing error, a slightly smudged section where the ink had run. "I'm going to need to verify this with the gate agent," Veronica announced. "Is something wrong?" Aisha asked, her smile faltering. "Just a precaution. Policy is policy. Please step aside while I make a call." "But we checked in properly," Ibrahim protested. "Everything was fine at the counter. It's our honeymoon." "I understand, sir, but I need to verify this. Please step aside." The couple moved to the side of the doorway, their excitement draining away as other passengers squeezed past them, casting curious glances. Veronica made a show of calling the gate, speaking in low tones while Aisha and Ibrahim stood there, embarrassment creeping up their necks. 15 minutes passed. Passengers continued to board, white, Asian, Arab, all waved through with minimal scrutiny. But the Nigerian couple waited, their special day tarnished by suspicion they'd done nothing to earn. Finally Veronica returned. "Everything checks out. You can proceed. Seats 3C and 3D. "Thank you," Aisha whispered, but her eyes were wet. As they passed, Veronica leaned toward another flight attendant, speaking just loud enough to be overheard. "I don't know how they afforded these seats." The couple froze mid-step, but Ibrahim gently guided his wife forward. They found their seats and buckled in silence, their joy thoroughly dampened. From seat 2C someone had been watching all of this. Someone small, with gold beads in her braids and wisdom in her eyes that didn't match her age. Zahra Okonkwo had been escorted to her seat by the kind airline representative from earlier, who'd made sure she was comfortable before heading back to assist other unaccompanied minors. Zahra had settled in, pulled out a book from her backpack, an advanced economics textbook that would surprise most adults, and began to read. But her attention kept drifting to the boarding process. To the way that flight attendant greeted different passengers. To the questions she asked some but not others. To the tone of her voice that shifted like a chameleon depending on who stood before her. Zahra noticed everything. When Veronica finally approached her seat, she did a double take. An unaccompanied minor. In first class. She checked her tablet, scrolling through the passenger manifest. "Well," Veronica said, her voice taking on that particular tone adults use when they're trying to sound patient with children but are actually annoyed. "Aren't you in the wrong seat, sweetheart?" Zahra looked up from her book, marking her place with a finger. "No, ma'am. This is seat 2C. That's what my boarding pass says." "Let me see it," Veronica said, holding out her hand. Zahra retrieved the pass from her backpack pocket and handed it over. Veronica studied it with the same excessive scrutiny she'd given Kofi's pass, as if searching for evidence of fraud. "An unaccompanied minor in first class," Veronica muttered. "That's unusual." "My father purchased the ticket," Zahra explained politely. "I'm visiting my grandmother in Brooklyn." "I see. And what does your father do?" It was an inappropriate question. None of her business really, but Zahra answered anyway. "He works in petroleum." Veronica's eyebrow arched. She glanced at the name on the ticket. "Okonkwo. Nigerian. I'm going to need to verify this with the gate. These mistakes happen sometimes. You might be more comfortable in economy with the other families." "This isn't a mistake," Zahra said, her voice still polite but with an edge of steel. "This is my seat." Veronica's smile was patronizing. "I'm sure you think it is, sweetheart, but let me just make a quick call." She stepped away, tablet in hand, and made another call to the gate agent. Zahra sat there, aware of the other passengers watching, aware of the pattern she was seeing. Kofi in 2A glanced over at her, recognition flickering in his eyes. He'd seen that look on her face before, on his own children's faces when they encountered injustice for the first time. 5 minutes passed before Veronica returned, her expression tight. "Everything checks out," she said, the words clearly bitter in her mouth. "But please don't touch anything unnecessarily. The entertainment system can be delicate." "I understand," Zahra replied, but her mind was working, filing away every word, every tone, every action. Veronica moved on to complete her pre-flight checks, greeting the remaining passengers as they boarded. Gerald Pemberton received a warm inquiry about his recent travels. Yuki got a polite nod. Kofi got a suspicious glance. And when the Diallos needed help storing their carry-on bag, Veronica's assistance was perfunctory at best, her movements brisk and impatient. The cabin doors closed. The safety demonstration began. The plane taxied toward the runway. And in seat 2C, an 8-year-old girl with gold beads in her braids closed her economics textbook and pulled out a small notebook instead. She began to write, documenting everything she'd observed. Times, names, actions, words. Her father had taught her many things. One of them was that injustice, when witnessed, becomes a responsibility. Another was that power without accountability is tyranny. And a third, perhaps most important, was that silence in the face of wrong is complicity. Zahra Okonkwo was not going to be silent. As Flight 7834 lifted off from Lagos, climbing into the cloudless African sky, none of the passengers could have known that this would be unlike any flight they'd ever taken. They couldn't have known that before they landed in New York 11 hours later, everything would change. That a CEO would be awakened in the middle of the night. That a phone would ring in a corporate office in Atlanta. That careers would end and policies would be rewritten. They couldn't have known that the smallest person in first class would teach the biggest lesson of all. But they were about to find out. If you're already hooked by Zahra's courage, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because this story is only just beginning, and what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. And here's a question for you. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this on a flight or in public? What did you do? Let us know in the comments below. The Boeing 777 reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the first-class cabin settled into the rhythm of a long-haul flight. Outside the windows, the West African coastline gave way to the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Inside, the atmosphere should have been one of relaxation and luxury, the kind of peace that passengers pay premium prices to experience. But tension was building in that cabin, invisible to some, painfully obvious to others. It started with the small things. The kinds of things that people who've never experienced discrimination might not even notice. The kinds of things that people who have experienced it recognize immediately, like a familiar song playing in a minor key. Kofi Mensah sat in seat 2A, trying to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his tray table. At 53 years old, he built a successful import-export business connecting Ghanaian manufacturers with American retailers. He'd made this exact flight, Lagos to New York, first class, seat 2A when available, at least once a month for the past 5 years. He knew the flight attendant's routine. He knew the meal service schedule. He knew which wines they typically offered and which movies would be available on the entertainment system. What he also knew, with the weary familiarity of a man who'd lived it countless times, was the particular brand of scrutiny that would follow him throughout this flight. He'd already endured it during boarding. The double-checking of his boarding pass. The thinly veiled suggestion that perhaps he'd made a mistake, that perhaps he belonged in economy. The way Veronica Hawthorn's eyes had lingered on him with suspicion, as if waiting for him to slip up and reveal himself as an imposter in this space of luxury. Kofi had maintained his dignity as he always did. He'd answered her questions politely. He'd taken his seat without making a scene. Because what was the alternative? To protest? To call out the discrimination in front of a cabin full of strangers? He tried that before years ago and learned that it usually made things worse. The offended party would deny any wrongdoing. Other passengers would look uncomfortable and turn away. And he would be labeled as difficult, aggressive, playing the race card. So he'd learned to swallow it. To document it quietly in his mind. To mention it later in customer feedback forms that probably went unread. To tell his wife about it when he got home, and she would sigh with that particular sadness of recognition, and they would shake their heads together at the way the world still worked in 2024. But today, Kofi wasn't the only one paying attention. From seat 2C directly across the aisle, Zahra Okonkwo watched everything with those sharp, observant eyes. She'd seen how Veronica had questioned Kofi's boarding pass twice. She'd seen the suspicion in the flight attendant's expression. And then moments later she'd seen Gerald Pemberton board and receive a completely different reception. Warm, familiar, his boarding pass never even requested. Zahra was 8 years old, but she understood what she was seeing. Her father had prepared her for this. He told her stories about his own experiences, about the assumptions people would make based on the color of her skin. He taught her the words for it: bias, discrimination, prejudice, racism. He'd also taught her that staying silent in the face of injustice was its own form of betrayal. She pulled out her small notebook, the one she used to write down interesting things she observed on her travels, and began to take notes. The time. The passenger's name, which she could see on the briefcase monogrammed with KM. The flight attendant's actions. The contrast in treatment. Her pen moved steadily across the page, her handwriting surprisingly neat for a child her age. The flight continued. Passengers settled in. Some opened laptops. Others reclined their seats and closed their eyes. Gerald Pemberton in 1A was already on his second complimentary champagne, chatting amiably with Veronica about his business travels. Yuki Tanaka in 4B browsed the entertainment system with childlike delight, overwhelmed by the selection of movies and shows. And then came the newlyweds. Aisha and Ibrahim Diallo had been trying to recapture the joy they'd felt when first booking these tickets 3 months ago. First class to New York for their honeymoon, it had felt like such an extravagance, such a perfect way to start their new life together. They'd saved for it, splurged on it, imagined how magical it would feel to fly in luxury for the first time. But the magic had started to tarnish the moment they'd handed their boarding passes to Veronica. Now, sitting in seats 3C and 3D, Ibrahim held his wife's hand tightly. Aisha's earlier excitement had dimmed. The 15-minute wait while Veronica verified their tickets, making them stand aside while other passengers boarded and found their seats, drawing stares and whispers, had been humiliating. The implication that they didn't belong here, that their presence in first class was somehow suspicious, had stung worse than any direct insult. Ibrahim had wanted to say something, to demand to know why they were being singled out. But like Kofi, he'd learned that making a scene rarely improved the situation. So he'd stood there watching white passengers and Asian passengers flow past them without a second glance, and he'd felt that familiar burn of anger mixed with helplessness. When Veronica had finally allowed them to proceed, her reluctance had been palpable. And then, that comment to another flight attendant, spoken just loud enough for them to hear, had been the final twist of the knife. I don't know how they afforded these seats. Aisha had actually stumbled when she heard it. Ibrahim had caught her, whispered that they should ignore it, that it wasn't worth it. But how do you ignore something like that? How do you unhear the implication that you're not good enough, not wealthy enough, that your presence in this space is somehow fraudulent? They'd reached their seats and buckled in silently. Aisha's beautiful Ankara dress suddenly felt too bright, too attention-drawing. Her head wrap, which she'd tied with such care that morning, now felt like a target on her head. Ibrahim squeezed her hand 3 times, their secret signal for "I love you," and she squeezed back, but her eyes remained fixed on the seat in front of her. From across the aisle and 1 row back, Zahra had watched the entire interaction. She'd seen the excitement drain from the couple's faces. She'd seen them deflate under the weight of Veronica's scrutiny. She'd heard that comment about affordability, and something had tightened in her chest. Her expression hardened. The pen in her hand pressed more firmly against the paper as she added more notes. More details. More evidence of a pattern she was beginning to see clearly. An hour into the flight, Veronica began preparing for the meal service. First-class dining on international flights was supposed to be an experience. Multiple courses, premium ingredients, wine pairings, attentive service. It was one of the main reasons people paid thousands of dollars extra for these seats. Veronica wheeled the service cart down the aisle, her professional smile fixed in place. She started with Gerald Pemberton as protocol dictated, front to back, window to aisle. "Mr. Pemberton," she said warmly, "for your main course this afternoon, we have pan-seared sea bass with lemon butter sauce, herb-crusted lamb chops with roasted vegetables, or a wild mushroom risotto. Which would you prefer?" Gerald barely looked up from his laptop. "I'll take the sea bass, Veronica. And another glass of that Chardonnay if you don't mind." "Excellent choice. Coming right up." She prepared his meal with care, arranging everything on the tray just so. The sea bass was plated beautifully, the vegetables artfully arranged. She included extra bread, a selection of condiments, and poured his wine with a flourish. "Anything else I can get for you?" she asked. "No, this looks perfect. Thank you." Next was Yuki in 4B. Veronica's warmth decreased by several degrees, her smile becoming more perfunctory. "Ma'am, for your meal we have sea bass, lamb chops, or mushroom risotto." "Oh, the sea bass please," Yuki said softly. "Of course." The service was polite but brief. No extra bread. No wine recommendation. Just the meal, placed on the tray table with efficient movements before Veronica moved on. Then she reached Kofi in 2A. Without preamble, without asking his preference, Veronica simply placed a tray on his table. The lamb chops. No inquiry about what he wanted. No presentation of options. Just the assumption that whatever she gave him would be acceptable. Kofi looked down at the meal, then up at Veronica. "Excuse me, I requested the vegetarian option when I booked my ticket." Veronica's expression flickered with annoyance. "That's not what I have listed here. I'm quite certain I selected it. Perhaps you could check again?" Veronica sighed, actually sighed, as if he'd just asked her to rebuild the aircraft's engine. "Sir, I have a cabin full of passengers to serve." Kofi pulled out his phone, opened the airline's app, and showed her his booking confirmation. There, in black and white, was his meal selection: vegetarian. For a moment, Veronica said nothing. Then she took the tray back with barely concealed frustration. "I'll see what I can find." "Thank you," Kofi said evenly, though his jaw was tight. Veronica disappeared into the galley. Several minutes passed. She served other passengers, including those seated behind Kofi, breaking the normal service order. When she finally returned with the mushroom risotto, she practically tossed it onto his tray table. No apology. No acknowledgement of the error. Just the meal, delivered with the minimum effort required. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, the words clipped. "No, thank you," Kofi replied, because what else could he say? Zahra watched this entire exchange with growing anger. She was young, but she wasn't naive. She recognized the pattern. She saw how Veronica's demeanor shifted depending on who she was serving. Warm and attentive with Gerald. Polite but distant with Yuki. Irritated and dismissive with Kofi. Across the aisle, Aisha and Ibrahim received similar treatment. Veronica didn't ask their preferences either, simply placed meals in front of them. Lamb for Ibrahim, sea bass for Aisha, without ceremony or care. "Excuse me," Aisha said politely, "I requested the vegetarian option as well." Veronica's expression was pure exasperation now. "Are you certain? I don't have that listed." "Yes, I'm certain. I selected it when booking, just like I selected these seats and checked in online and did everything correctly, just like everyone else on this plane." There was an edge to Aisha's voice now, the accumulated frustration finally breaking through her polite facade. "I'll have to check," Veronica said coldly, taking the tray back. But unlike with Kofi, she didn't return quickly. She finished serving the entire cabin first, including the passengers in the rows behind them, before finally bringing Aisha's vegetarian meal. Ibrahim had waited to eat, unwilling to start while his wife sat there with empty hands. When Veronica finally returned, neither of them said thank you. They simply took the meal and turned away. Then Veronica reached Zahra in 2C. The 8-year-old had been reading her economics textbook, genuinely engaged with a chapter on supply and demand curves. She looked up when Veronica's shadow fell across her page. Without asking, without even making eye contact, Veronica said, "The children's meal is chicken nuggets or pasta." "Which one?" Zahra closed her book carefully, marking her place. "May I see the menu, please?" Veronica blinked, as if surprised that a child would make such a request. "The children's meal is chicken nuggets or pasta," she repeated, slower this time, as if Zahra hadn't understood. "I heard you," Zahra said politely. "But I'd like to see the full menu, please." Veronica's lips pressed into a thin line. She pulled out a menu card and handed it over with obvious reluctance. Zahra studied it, the same options Gerald had been offered, the same gourmet descriptions. "I'd like the grilled salmon, please." "That's an adult meal." "I'm aware. That's what I'd like. The children's meal is more appropriate for your age." Zahra looked up at Veronica with those steady, unflinching eyes. "My father allows me to order what I want. I'd like the grilled salmon, please." A muscle twitched in Veronica's jaw. Around them, other passengers had started to notice the interaction. Kofi was watching openly now. Even Gerald had glanced over from his laptop. "I'll have to charge extra for an adult meal," Veronica said, though this wasn't actually true. Meal selection was included in the first-class ticket price regardless of the passenger's age. "That's fine," Zahra replied calmly, though she knew it shouldn't cost extra. Her father had taught her to pick her battles, and this wasn't the hill to die on. Not yet. Veronica took the menu back and disappeared. When she returned with the salmon, she placed it on Zahra's tray table without a word. No utensils. No napkin. No water refill. Just the plate. Zahra looked at the meal, then at the empty space where silverware should be. "May I have silverware, please?" Veronica had already moved away. Either she didn't hear or she pretended not to. "Excuse me," Zahra said louder. "I need silverware." Veronica turned back, annoyed. "What?" "Silverware, please." The flight attendant grabbed a fork and knife from her cart and handed them over with an eye roll subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability but obvious enough to make her feelings clear. "Thank you," Zahra said, her voice still polite but with an undercurrent of something harder. She was keeping count. Writing a ledger in her mind. Every slight. Every microaggression. Every moment of disrespect. The meal service continued. Passengers ate. Some dozed off. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its mid-Atlantic cruise. Outside the windows, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, a reminder of just how isolated they all were up here at 37,000 feet. 2 hours later, Aisha needed to use the restroom. It was a simple, basic need, the kind of thing that shouldn't require any thought or planning. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stepped into the aisle, and walked toward the first-class lavatory at the front of the cabin. She'd barely taken 3 steps when Veronica appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, blocking her path. "Ma'am, the economy bathrooms are in the back of the aircraft." Aisha stopped, confused. "I'm sorry?" "The economy lavatories," Veronica repeated, gesturing toward the rear of the plane. "They're past the second galley." "I'm in first class," Aisha said slowly, still trying to process what was happening. "Seat 3C. These facilities are for first-class passengers." The words hung in the air between them. Around them, passengers were starting to stare. Conversations paused mid-sentence. People lowered their books and tablets. Aisha felt heat rising up her neck. "I am a first-class passenger. I just told you, seat 3C. Ma'am, I need you to. Are you seriously telling me I can't use the bathroom?" Aisha's voice rose, not quite shouting but loud enough to carry. 3 hours of accumulated humiliation suddenly came pouring out. "I paid for this seat. I paid for this ticket. I have every right to use this bathroom." Ibrahim was out of his seat now, moving to his wife's side. "What's going on?" "She's trying to send me to economy," Aisha said, her voice shaking with anger and the threat of tears. Veronica's professional mask was cracking. "Sir, if you and your wife would just—" "We're first-class passengers," Ibrahim said firmly. "Our seats are right there. You can see them from here. Why would you think we need to go to economy to use the bathroom?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because everyone in that cabin knew the answer. They knew exactly why Veronica had made that assumption. It wasn't about seats or tickets or any legitimate confusion. It was about who Veronica thought belonged in first class and who didn't. Gerald Pemberton, who'd been trying to ignore the commotion, finally looked up. Even he could see that this had crossed a line. Yuki had her hand over her mouth, horrified. Kofi was halfway out of his seat, ready to intervene if needed. And Zahra was writing furiously in her notebook, documenting everything with the precision of a court stenographer. "I apologize for the confusion," Veronica finally said, the words forced out through clenched teeth. "You may use the lavatory." She stepped aside. Aisha walked past her, head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. She entered the bathroom and locked the door, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened. Ibrahim stood in the aisle a moment longer, staring at Veronica. He wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, to call out the discrimination for what it was. But he also knew that making a bigger scene might result in them being labeled as disruptive passengers. Might even get them removed from the plane if it landed for fuel somewhere. So he simply shook his head and returned to his seat. The cabin slowly returned to its previous state of quiet. Passengers went back to their movies and books, but the atmosphere had shifted. The veneer of civilized luxury had cracked, revealing something uglier underneath. Gerald Pemberton found himself deeply uncomfortable. He'd witnessed the entire incident with Kofi's meal, the treatment of the newlyweds, and now this bathroom confrontation. He was a privileged man, he'd be the first to admit that, but he wasn't blind. He'd seen discrimination before, usually from a distance, and he'd always told himself it wasn't his place to get involved. But watching it happen 3 feet away from him in a space where he was comfortable and welcomed, made it impossible to ignore. He glanced at Zahra, who was still writing in that notebook. "What are you writing, young lady?" he asked, his voice gentle. Zahra looked up, considering whether to answer honestly. Then she decided this man deserved to know. "Just observations." "Observations about what?" "About how some people get treated differently than others. About how some people have to prove they belong while others don't. About how respect isn't given equally." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Those are very mature observations for someone your age. My father says that injustice doesn't care about age. If you can see it, you have a responsibility to acknowledge it." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is," Zahra said simply and returned to her writing. Gerald turned back to his laptop, but he couldn't focus on his work anymore. The spreadsheets and quarterly projections suddenly seemed trivial. He'd just been called out, politely, gently, but called out nonetheless, by an 8-year-old girl who saw more clearly than he'd been willing to see. In seat 2A, Kofi was thinking about all the times he'd experienced this exact pattern. Different flights, different cities, different years, but the same fundamental problem. He thought about his children, about the conversations he'd had to have with them about how the world would perceive them, about the extra hurdles they'd have to clear simply because of the skin they were born in. He thought about how tired he was. Not just physically tired from the travel, but soul tired from having to constantly prove himself, constantly justify his presence in spaces where others moved freely without question. And in seats 3C and 3D, Aisha had returned from the bathroom with red-rimmed eyes, and Ibrahim held her hand while she cried quietly. Their honeymoon had been tainted. The joy they should have been feeling, the excitement of starting their lives together, of traveling to New York, of experiencing luxury they'd worked so hard to afford, had been poisoned by prejudice they'd done nothing to deserve. Veronica, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley. She stood there, preparing beverages, checking inventory, doing the routine tasks that had defined her career for 18 years. If she felt any guilt about what had transpired, she didn't show it. In her mind, she'd simply been doing her job, maintaining standards, following protocols. That's what she told herself. That's what she'd always told herself. But deep in the aircraft, in that sealed metal tube hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour, something was building. A reckoning was approaching. The smallest person in first class had seen everything, documented everything, and was preparing to do something about it. Because Zahra Okonkwo was her father's daughter. And her father had taught her that power without accountability was tyranny, that silence in the face of wrong was complicity, and that sometimes, even when you're 8 years old, even when you're outnumbered, even when it's scary, you have to stand up. The plane flew on through the afternoon sky, approaching the halfway point of its journey. The passengers didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something extraordinary. They were about to learn that courage comes in all sizes, that justice doesn't wait for adulthood, and that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the smallest person. The tension was building. The pattern was clear. The documentation was complete. And Zahra was almost ready to act. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and struggled with whether to speak up? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see how this brave little girl takes on injustice, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. 6 hours into the flight, the first-class cabin had transformed into a cocoon of artificial twilight. The overhead lights had been dimmed to encourage rest, leaving only the soft glow of individual reading lamps and entertainment screens to illuminate the space. Outside the windows, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the clouds below in shades of orange and pink. Most passengers had reclined their seats, some dozing, others absorbed in movies or books. The hum of the engines provided a constant, almost hypnotic backdrop. It should have been peaceful. It should have been the kind of serene luxury that justified the astronomical ticket prices. But peace was about to shatter. Kofi Mensah had been trying to read a contract proposal for the past 20 minutes, squinting at the small print in the dim cabin lighting. His overhead reading light, the focus beam designed specifically for situations like this, had stopped working about an hour ago. He tried the switch multiple times, toggling it on and off, but nothing happened. Finally, accepting that it wasn't going to magically fix itself, he reached up and pressed the call button. The soft chime echoed through the quiet cabin. A minute passed. Then another. Kofi waited patiently, knowing the flight attendants might be in the galley or assisting other passengers. Finally, Veronica Hawthorn appeared, emerging from the dim galley area with an expression that made it clear she'd been interrupted. "What is it?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth she'd shown other passengers throughout the flight. Kofi gestured to the overhead panel. "My reading light isn't working. Could you check it, please?" Veronica glanced up at the light, barely making an effort to actually assess the situation. "I'm not maintenance, sir. You'll have to manage without it." Kofi blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" "I'm not maintenance," Veronica repeated, already turning to leave. "There's nothing I can do about it. You'll have to make do. But surely there's something you can try? Or perhaps you have a portable lamp." Veronica's expression hardened. "Sir, if your light isn't working, it isn't working. I can't fix the aircraft's electrical system. You're welcome to use your personal device if you need light." And with that, she walked away, leaving Kofi sitting there in semi-darkness, the contract still unread on his lap. He felt the familiar burn of frustration mixed with resignation. Of course his broken light wasn't worth her time. Of course he was expected to simply manage, while paying thousands of dollars for premium service. He closed the contract folder, no longer in the mood to work. Instead, he reclined his seat slightly and closed his eyes, trying to find sleep in the midst of his anger. 5 minutes later, 5 minutes, another call button chimed through the cabin. This one came from seat 1A. Gerald Pemberton's seat. Kofi's eyes opened. He didn't sit up, didn't move, but he was suddenly very alert, listening intently to what would happen next. Veronica appeared again, moving down the aisle toward the front of the cabin. Her demeanor had completely changed. The irritation had vanished, replaced by attentive concern. "Yes, Mr. Pemberton?" she asked, her voice warm. "What can I do for you?" Gerald, who had been reading a financial report on his tablet, looked up apologetically. "I hate to bother you, Veronica, but my reading light seems a bit dim. I'm having trouble seeing the numbers on these spreadsheets. Is there any way to adjust it?" "Oh, absolutely." Veronica's response was immediate, enthusiastic. "Let me take a look right away." She leaned over Gerald's seat, examining the light fixture. She toggled the switch, adjusted the angle, tested the brightness. You're right. It is a bit dim. Let me see what I can do." Kofi watched this entire interaction from his seat, his jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. 5 minutes ago, his completely non-functional light hadn't warranted any effort. Now, a slightly dim light was receiving full troubleshooting attention. But Veronica wasn't done. "You know what, Mr. Pemberton? I think I have just the thing." She disappeared toward the back of first class, where a storage compartment held various supplies. Moments later, she returned carrying a portable LED reading lamp, a flexible lamp with a clip base and adjustable arm. "Here we are," she said brightly, clipping it to Gerald's seat. "This should give you plenty of light for your work. How's that?" Gerald tested it, the bright LED illuminating his tablet screen perfectly. "That's wonderful, Veronica. Thank you so much for going to the trouble." "No trouble at all. That's what I'm here for. Just let me know if you need anything else." She stood there another moment, making sure he was satisfied before heading back toward the galley. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that even passengers who'd been trying to sleep had noticed. Yuki Tanaka, who'd witnessed both interactions, looked troubled. A businessman in seat 5A shook his head slowly. Even Gerald himself seemed uncomfortable, though he said nothing. But the person who noticed most of all was Zahra Okonkwo. She'd been awake the entire time, her economics textbook long since set aside. She'd watched Veronica dismiss Kofi's legitimate problem without even attempting to help. She'd watched that same flight attendant bend over backward, literally, to assist Gerald with a far less serious issue. And she'd seen Veronica produce a portable lamp from storage, a lamp that apparently existed and was available, but somehow hadn't been an option for Kofi minutes earlier. This was the moment. This was the breaking point. This was when Zahra decided that enough was enough. She'd been documenting the discrimination all flight, taking notes, recording times, cataloging incidents. But documentation without action is just a diary entry. Her father had taught her that witnessing injustice creates a responsibility. Not when you're older. Not when it's more convenient. Not when someone else does it first. No. Zahra reached up and pressed her call button. The chimes sounded through the cabin, cutting through the quiet. Passengers who just settled back into their movies or books or attempted sleep looked up with mild annoyance. Who was calling the flight attendant now? In the galley, Veronica heard the chime and checked her panel to see which seat had called. 2C, the child. The little girl who'd already been more trouble than she was worth, questioning meal choices and asking for silverware like it was some kind of imposition. Veronica took her time responding. She finished organizing the beverage cart she'd been working on. She checked her appearance in the small galley mirror, smoothing back a strand of hair that had escaped her bun. She composed her expression into that professional mask, though underneath it, irritation simmered. Finally, a full 2 minutes after the call button had been pressed, she walked down the aisle to seat 2C. Yes. The single word was clipped, barely polite. Zahra looked up at her with those steady, observant eyes that seemed far too knowing for an 8-year-old. "I'd like to speak with you about your service." Veronica's eyebrows rose. "Everything is fine. Go back to sleep." "No, it's not fine." Zahra's voice was calm, measured, but there was steel underneath. "You've been treating the black passengers differently all flight." The words fell into the cabin like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shocked silence in all directions. Passengers who'd been half asleep were suddenly alert. Entertainment screens were paused. Books were lowered. Every person in first class was now paying attention. Veronica's face flushed red. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you don't understand how airlines work. There are protocols, procedures." "I understand discrimination when I see it," Zahra interrupted, still calm, still steady. I've been watching you all flight. You questioned Mr. Mensah's boarding pass twice but didn't check Mr. Pemberton's at all. You made Mr. and Mrs. Diallo wait 15 minutes to verify their tickets while other passengers boarded without any delay. You commented that you didn't know how they could afford first-class seats. I heard you say that. You refused to help Mr. Mensah when his reading light broke, but 5 minutes later you brought Mr. Pemberton a portable lamp for a light that was just dim. Each example landed like a hammer blow. Veronica's face was now moving from red to pale, the color draining as she realized this child had documented everything. I'm going to need you to lower your voice, Veronica said, trying to regain control of the situation. You're disturbing other passengers. But Zahra didn't lower her voice. She kept it at exactly the same calm, clear level, loud enough to be heard throughout the cabin but not shouting. I'd like your employee number and full name, please. Veronica let out a laugh, but it was forced, nervous. You're a child. Now sit down. I'm a passenger on this flight who has witnessed discriminatory behavior, and I'm entitled to your identification so I can file a formal complaint. Zahra's words were precise, almost rehearsed, as if she'd been taught exactly how to handle this situation. And perhaps she had been. Perhaps her father, a man who'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, who'd faced discrimination countless times in his own rise to power, had prepared his daughter for exactly this moment. Kofi Mensah was sitting up now, fully alert. He'd spent the entire flight swallowing his anger, maintaining his dignity, telling himself it wasn't worth making a scene. But watching this 8-year-old girl do what he hadn't been willing to do filled him with a complex mixture of shame and hope and profound respect. Aisha and Ibrahim were holding hands again, but this time it wasn't in defeat. Aisha had tears in her eyes, but they were different tears now, tears of vindication, of being seen, of having someone finally name what had been happening all flight. Even Gerald Pemberton was paying full attention now. The reading lamp Veronica had brought him suddenly feeling like evidence of his own complicity in the discrimination he'd been benefiting from. Veronica looked around the cabin, seeing all the eyes on her, feeling the shift in the atmosphere. She was losing control of this situation, and she didn't know how to regain it. So she did what people often do when they're cornered and defensive. She doubled down. This is your chance to apologize, Zahra said, her voice still remarkably calm. To everyone you've disrespected. Veronica actually laughed again, more confidently this time. Or what? You'll tell your parents? The condescension was thick now, dismissive. Sweetheart, I've been doing this job for 18 years. I know how to handle difficult passengers. I'm not being difficult, Zahra replied. I'm identifying discrimination. There's a difference. You're a child who doesn't understand the complexities of airline service, Veronica shot back. Now, I'm telling you one last time, sit down and be quiet or I will have to involve the captain. It was a threat. A clear, direct threat. The implication being that Zahra was the problem passenger, that she was being disruptive, that she would face consequences if she didn't back down right now. But Zahra didn't back down. Instead, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. At 8 years old, standing in the aisle, she was tiny compared to the 42-year-old flight attendant towering over her. But something about her presence filled that space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She stood with her back straight, her chin up, her gold-beaded braids catching the dim cabin light. I'm giving you one warning, Zahra said, her voice carrying through the entire cabin now. Apologize now and this ends here. This was the moment from the opening hook. This was the image that passengers would remember for the rest of their lives. A small black girl in a purple dress, standing up to injustice at 37,000 feet, refusing to be silenced or dismissed. Veronica felt the weight of every eye in that cabin. She saw Kofi watching with an expression she couldn't quite read. She saw Aisha crying and Ibrahim's protective arm around her shoulders. She saw Yuki with her hand over her mouth. She saw Gerald Pemberton looking deeply uncomfortable, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know what. And she made a choice. Go back to your seat before I have the captain involved, she said, her voice hard. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by a child about how to do my job. Zahra stood her ground. The cabin was so quiet now that the engine noise seemed deafening by comparison. Passengers barely breathed, waiting to see what would happen next. This is your last chance to apologize, Zahra said, each word deliberate and clear. My father doesn't tolerate disrespect. Veronica's lip curled into something that might have been a smile or might have been a sneer. The confidence was coming back now, the sense that she was in control, that this was just a child making empty threats. And who exactly is your father? She asked, the condescension so thick you could cut it with a knife. What's he going to do, write a complaint letter? Around the cabin, passengers were fully awake now, some leaning into the aisles to see better. The businessman in 5A had his phone out, recording. Yuki was gripping her armrests so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Gerald had closed his laptop entirely, all pretense of working abandoned. Kofi found himself holding his breath. He'd seen this moment play out before in different settings, different circumstances. The moment when someone stands up to injustice and faces that crucial question, what are you going to do about it? Usually the answer was nothing. Usually the person making the complaint discovered they had no real power, no leverage, no way to force accountability. Usually the system protected its own and dismissed the complainant. But Kofi had a feeling this time might be different. There was something about the way Zahra stood there, the absolute certainty in her posture, the lack of fear in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't making empty threats. She knew something that Veronica didn't know. And she was about to reveal it. Zahra reached into the seat pocket in front of her and pulled out her phone. A smartphone with satellite connectivity, the kind that worked even over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where regular cell service was impossible. It was an expensive piece of technology, the kind most 8-year-olds didn't carry. But then again, most 8-year-olds weren't the children of billionaires. "I'll show you," Zahra said simply. She unlocked the phone with her thumbprint. The screen illuminated her face with a soft glow. And then, while the entire cabin watched in stunned silence, she placed a call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a man's voice answered, deep and warm even through the phone's speaker, though groggy with sleep. "Zahra? Baby, are you okay? It's the middle of the night here." "I'm sorry to wake you, Daddy," Zahra said, and for the first time since this confrontation began, her voice wavered slightly. "But I need you to make a call." Veronica's confident expression had started to crack. Something about the way Zahra was speaking, about the obvious wealth implied by that satellite phone, about the term of endearment from whoever was on the other end. Daddy, not dad or father, but daddy, the way children of the wealthy and powerful often address their parents, was making her nervous. "What's wrong?" Chukwuemeka Okonkwo's voice sharpened, the grogginess burning away in an instant. "Are you safe? Is the plane okay?" "The plane is fine, Daddy. I'm fine. But there's a flight attendant who's been treating the black passengers badly all flight. She's questioned their tickets, made them wait, refused to help them, said rude things. I've documented everything, times, names, specific incidents. I asked her to apologize, but she refused." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Chukwuemeka spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. It was no longer the concerned father worried about his daughter. It was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, a man accustomed to wielding power and expecting results. "What's the flight number?" "Ta 7834. Lagos to New York." "Transcontinental Airways," Chukwuemeka said, and there was something in his voice that made Veronica's blood run cold. "The flight attendant's name?" Zahra looked up at Veronica, who was now visibly pale, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "She hasn't given me her name yet, but her name tag says V. Hawthorn." "Veronica Hawthorn," Chukwuemeka repeated, and Zahra could hear him moving now, could hear the rustle of sheets, the sound of a light being turned on. "Okay, baby. Give me 5 minutes. I'm going to make some calls. Can you stay on the line with me?" "Yes, Daddy." Veronica found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Miss Zahra, there's no need to involve anyone else. I'm sure we can resolve this." But Zahra held up a hand, silencing her. On the phone, her father was already dialing another number, making another call on a different device. Zahra could hear him speaking, his voice muffled as he held his phone away from his mouth. The cabin remained frozen in this tableau. Zahra standing in the aisle, phone pressed to her ear. Veronica beside her, no longer threatening, no longer condescending, now looking increasingly worried. And 16 first-class passengers watching the entire scene unfold, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Zahra," her father's voice came back, clear and focused. "I'm on a conference call with Richard Castellanos. He's the CEO of Transcontinental Airways. I'm going to put you on speaker. I want you to tell him exactly what you told me. Can you do that?" Zahra's voice steadied. This was what her father had prepared her for. This was why he'd taught her to document injustice, to speak clearly, to know her rights. "Yes, Daddy." Veronica actually stumbled backward a step. Richard Castellanos. The CEO. The man at the very top of the company hierarchy, the man whose decisions affected tens of thousands of employees and millions of passengers. Oh. How did this child have direct access to the CEO of Transcontinental Airways? The answer was actually simple. though Veronica wouldn't understand it for a few more minutes. Chukwuemeka Okonkwo's company, Okonkwo Petroleum Industries, was one of the largest suppliers of jet fuel in West Africa. They had contracts with virtually every airline that operated in the region. And Transcontinental Airways, with its extensive African routes, had a particularly large contract, $340 million annually to be precise. When the CEO of your fuel supplier calls you at 3 in the morning and says there's a problem with one of your flight attendants, you take that call very seriously. "Hello, Zahra," a new voice came through the phone, male American with the crisp diction of a corporate executive trying to sound friendly while simultaneously terrified about what he was about to hear. "This is Richard Castellanos. Your father tells me you've experienced some problems on one of our flights. Can you tell me what happened?" Zahra took a breath. Then, with the same calm, clear voice she'd used throughout this ordeal, she began to recount the flight. Not with emotion or hyperbole, but with facts. Times, names, specific incidents. The double-checking of boarding passes. The 15-minute wait. The overheard comment about affordability. The meal service discrepancies. The bathroom incident. The broken reading light. She laid it out like a prosecutor presenting evidence, which in a sense she was. Other passengers listened, some with shame as they realized they'd witnessed these incidents and done nothing. Kofi felt tears pricking his eyes, not of sadness but of something else. Vindication. Recognition. The profound relief of being seen. Aisha was crying openly now, and Ibrahim pulled her closer, his own eyes wet. Even Gerald Pemberton felt his chest tighten. That reading lamp sitting on his tray table suddenly felt like an accusation. When Zahra finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Then Richard Castellanos spoke, and his voice had gone from friendly concern to barely controlled fury. "Miss Hawthorn is standing there with you now?" "Yes, sir." "Put her on the phone." Zahra held the phone out to Veronica, who took it with a shaking hand. She held it to her ear, turning slightly away from the cabin as if that would provide some privacy for what was about to be the worst conversation of her professional life. "This is Veronica Hawthorn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The passengers couldn't hear what Richard Castellanos was saying, but they could see Veronica's reaction. The color draining from her face. The way her free hand came up to cover her mouth. The slight tremor that started in her shoulders and worked its way down her body. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand." "Yes. No, yes, sir. Right away." She handed the phone back to Zahra with a hand that visibly shook. Chukwuemeka's voice came back on. "Zahra, are you okay? Do you feel safe?" "Yes, Daddy. Mr. Castellanos is going to make sure you're taken care of for the rest of the flight. When you land, there will be people there to make sure you get to Grandma safely. I'm so proud of you, baby. You did the right thing." "I learned from the best," Zahra said, and for the first time she smiled. "I love you. Call me when you land." "I love you too, Daddy." She ended the call and looked up at Veronica, who was now openly crying, mascara running down her cheeks. Veronica's voice cracked. "I owe you all an apology." But Zahra shook her head. "Not to me. To them." She gestured to Kofi, to Aisha and Ibrahim, to the other passengers who'd experienced her discrimination throughout the flight. Veronica turned to face the cabin. Every eye was on her. There was nowhere to hide, no way to deny what had happened, no way to deflect or excuse. The CEO of her company had just ordered her to apologize, and she knew with absolute certainty that her 18-year career had just ended. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I apologize. I was unprofessional. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I treated some of you differently, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, inadequate and hollow, but at least they'd been said. Kofi nodded slowly, accepting the apology without warmth. It didn't undo the humiliation he'd felt, but at least it acknowledged it. Aisha couldn't speak, so Ibrahim spoke for both of them. "Thank you for the apology. It should never have been necessary." Veronica nodded, tears still streaming. Then she turned and walked toward the galley, her professional composure completely shattered. Another flight attendant, Marcus, who'd been in the galley during most of these incidents, emerged to check on the cabin. He approached Zahra first, his expression a mixture of respect and concern. "Is there anything you need, miss?" "No, thank you," Zahra said politely. "I'm fine now." She sat back down in her seat, buckled her seatbelt, and picked up her economics textbook as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. As if she hadn't just taken down a discriminatory flight attendant with the precision of a corporate lawyer. As if she was just an 8-year-old girl reading about supply and demand curves. But everyone in that cabin knew they'd just witnessed something remarkable. Kofi found himself smiling for the first time all flight. Aisha wiped her eyes and leaned against Ibrahim, feeling lighter than she had in hours. Gerald Pemberton was staring at that reading lamp, and suddenly he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He walked over to Kofi's seat. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm Gerald Pemberton. I wanted to apologize. I saw what was happening and I should have said something. I didn't, and that was wrong." Kofi looked up at this white executive who'd enjoyed preferential treatment all flight, now standing in the aisle offering an apology, and felt something shift. "Thank you for saying that. It means something." Gerald nodded, then walked to where Aisha and Ibrahim sat. "I'm sorry to both of you as well. What happened to you was inexcusable, and I should have spoken up." Ibrahim nodded. Aisha managed a smile. Then Gerald did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked to Zahra's seat. "Young lady," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "thank you. You did what I should have done. You have more courage at 8 than most of us have in a lifetime." Zahra looked up from her book and gave him a small smile. "My father says that privilege means having the power to speak up. If you have that power and don't use it, then you're choosing to side with injustice." Gerald felt those words land in his chest like a physical blow. "Your father is absolutely right. I'll remember that." He returned to his seat, unclipped the reading lamp Veronica had brought him, and walked it over to Kofi. "I believe this should have been yours in the first place." Kofi's eyes widened slightly. Then he accepted the lamp with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you." The cabin slowly settled back into quietness, but it was a different quiet now. The tension had broken. Justice, imperfect, incomplete, but justice nonetheless, had been served. The passengers returned to their entertainment, their books, their attempts at sleep. But nobody would forget this flight. Nobody would forget the little girl who stood up when others stayed seated. In the galley, Veronica sat on a small fold-down seat, her face in her hands. Marcus stood nearby, not sure what to say. He'd witnessed some of the incidents, had felt uncomfortable about them, but hadn't spoken up. Now he was wondering if his silence had made him complicit. The plane flew on through the night, carrying its passengers toward New York, toward their destinations, toward their futures. But something fundamental had shifted in that cabin. Seeds had been planted, of awareness, of courage, of accountability. Zahra Okonkwo returned to her economics textbook, gold beads in her braids catching the overhead light, a small smile on her face. She'd done what her father had taught her to do. She'd stood up. She'd spoken out. She'd refused to be made small. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone on that flight of a simple truth. Justice doesn't wait for adulthood, dignity doesn't have an age requirement, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one willing to speak the truth that everyone else is too afraid to say. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up and regretted it later? Share your story in the comments. And if you want to see the powerful conclusion to Zahra's story when the plane lands, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith and accountability. For a moment, the entire first-class cabin held its breath. Veronica Hawthorn stood there, her professional mask cracking at the edges, that condescending smile still playing on her lips as she waited for this 8-year-old child to back down. She'd seen it countless times before. Passengers who threatened to complain, who promised consequences, who swore they'd report her behavior. And every single time nothing had happened. 47 complaints over 18 years, all dismissed, all explained away, all swept under the corporate rug of airline bureaucracy. She had no reason to believe this time would be any different. But Zahra Okonkwo wasn't bluffing. And she wasn't afraid. The little girl reached into the seat pocket in front of her with a calm, deliberate movement that somehow commanded attention despite her small size. Her fingers closed around something. A phone, but not just any phone. This was a high-end smartphone with satellite connectivity, the kind that costs thousands of dollars, the kind that works even over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where 37,000 feet below, waves crashed in darkness and regular cell service was nothing but a distant memory. Zahra held up the phone, and in that moment, with the soft glow of the screen illuminating her face and reflecting off the gold beads in her braids, she looked both impossibly young and impossibly wise. Her dark eyes met Veronica's pale blue ones, and without a trace of uncertainty in her voice, she said 3 simple words that would change everything. "I'll show you." Her thumb moved across the screen with practiced ease, unlocking it, navigating to her contacts. Veronica watched, that amused smile still fixed on her face, though something in her eyes had started to shift. A flicker of uncertainty, like a crack appearing in ice that had seemed solid just moments before. Around them, passengers leaned forward in their seats. The businessman in 5A had his phone out, recording. Yuki Tanaka's hands were clasped together as if in prayer. Gerald Pemberton had closed his laptop completely, all pretense of working abandoned. Kofi Mensah sat perfectly still, but his eyes were sharp, alert, watching every movement of this extraordinary child who was doing what he himself hadn't been able to do. Zahra selected a contact. The entry simply read, "Daddy" with a heart emoji, and pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Twice. Each ring seemed to echo through the silent cabin, though of course that was impossible. The sound came only from Zahra's phone. But in the attention of every passenger focused on this small girl, it felt as though the entire aircraft was holding its breath, waiting. 3 rings. Then a voice answered, deep and warm even through the phone's speaker, though rough with sleep. "Zahra? Baby, are you okay? It's the middle of the night here." The concern in that voice was immediate, visceral, the kind of worry that only a parent can feel when their child calls at an unexpected hour. In Lagos it was 3:17 in the morning. Chukwuemeka Okonkwo had been asleep in his bed, in the home he'd built with his late wife, dreaming perhaps of the daughter currently somewhere over the Atlantic, when his phone had rung with that specific ringtone he'd set just for Zahra's number, the one that would wake him from even the deepest sleep. "I'm sorry to wake you, Daddy," Zahra said, and for the first time since this confrontation had begun, her voice wavered just slightly, not with fear or uncertainty, but with the genuine regret of a child who hates to worry her father. "But I need you to make a call." Veronica's amused expression flickered. Something about the way Zahra spoke, the calm authority in her voice, the confidence that her father would help her, the obvious wealth implied by that satellite phone, and the way she said, "Daddy," with that particular inflection, was starting to penetrate her armor of certainty. "What's wrong?" Chukwuemeka's voice sharpened instantly, the grogginess burning away like morning fog under sunlight. "Are you safe? Is the plane okay? Is there an emergency?" "The plane is fine, Daddy. I'm safe. There's no emergency with the aircraft." Zahra's voice steadied again, returning to that remarkable composure. "But there's a flight attendant who's been treating the black passengers differently all flight. Not just me, other passengers too. She questioned their tickets multiple times when she didn't question white passengers at all. She made a couple wait 15 minutes to verify their boarding passes while everyone else walked right through. She said she didn't know how they could afford first-class seats. I heard her say it. She refused to help a man when his reading light broke, but 5 minutes later she brought a portable lamp to a white passenger whose light was just dim. She tried to send a woman to the economy bathroom even though she's sitting in first class. I've documented everything, times, names, specific incidents. I asked her to apologize and she refused." As Zahra spoke, laying out the evidence with the precision of a prosecutor presenting a case, Veronica's face underwent a transformation. The amused condescension drained away, replaced first by surprise, then by growing alarm. This child had been watching. This child had been taking notes. This child had documented everything with a level of detail that would make any lawyer proud. And she was reporting it directly to her father at 3 in the morning. On the other end of the line there was a pause. Not a long pause, maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, Veronica could almost hear the gears turning. Could almost sense the shift from concerned parent to something else entirely. When Chukwuemeka Okonkwo spoke again, his voice had changed completely. It was no longer the worried father speaking to his daughter. It was the voice of a man who had built a $4.2 billion empire from nothing. The voice of a CEO who employed 15,000 people across 3 continents. The voice of someone who had faced discrimination himself countless times on his rise to power and had sworn that his daughter would never have to accept it silently. It was the voice of power, barely controlled, running through words like electricity through copper wire. "What's the flight number?" "Ta 7834. Lagos to New York. Transcontinental Airways." He said it like he was reading an entry in a ledger, mentally accessing information stored in that brilliant mind that tracked contracts and connections and business relationships with photographic precision. "What's the flight attendant's name?" Zahra looked up at Veronica, whose face was now visibly pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as realization began to dawn, though she still didn't understand the full picture, didn't yet comprehend just how catastrophically she had miscalculated. "She hasn't given me her name yet, but her name tag says V. Hawthorn. Veronica Hawthorn." Chukwuemeka repeated the name slowly, committing it to memory, and there was something in the way he said it that made it sound like a verdict being entered into a permanent record. "Okay, baby. Give me 5 minutes. I'm going to make some calls. Can you stay on the line with me?" "Yes, Daddy." Veronica found her voice, though it came out strangled, higher pitched than normal, the professional polish completely gone. Miss Zahra, there's really no need to involve anyone else. I'm sure we can resolve this right here. I could have been more. Let's just all take a breath and... But Zahra held up one small hand, silencing her with a gesture that would have been imperious if it hadn't been so completely justified. The little girl's eyes never left Veronica's face, and in that steady gaze was something that made the flight attendant's protests die in her throat. Through the phone they could hear Chukwuemeka moving. The rustle of expensive sheets. The soft click of a lamp being turned on. The sound of footsteps crossing a marble floor. And then his voice, slightly muffled as he held his personal phone away from his mouth and spoke into another device. His business phone, the one that connected directly to people who mattered, people who made decisions, people who held power. Richard. Yes, I know what time it is. We need to talk. No. It's about your airline. Veronica actually stumbled backward a step. Richard. There was only one Richard who would matter in a conversation about transcontinental airways. Richard Castellanos. The CEO. The man at the very top of the entire corporate structure. The man whose office was in Atlanta, whose decisions affected 40,000 employees and millions of passengers annually, whose approval was required for any major policy change or high-level hiring or firing. Oh. How did this child's father have the personal phone number of Richard Castellanos? How did he feel comfortable calling the CEO of a major international airline at 3 a.m? How did he speak to him with such casual authority, not as a supplicant requesting a favor, but as an equal, no, as someone with leverage? The cabin had gone so quiet that passengers could hear their own heartbeats. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the ever-present hum of the engines seemed to fade into background noise as everyone strained to hear what would happen next. Chukwuemeka's voice came back, clear and focused now. Zahra, I'm on a conference call with Richard Castellanos. He's the CEO of Transcontinental Airways. I've explained the situation. He wants to hear directly from you about what happened. I'm going to put you on speaker. Can you tell him exactly what you told me? All the details, just like we practice for situations like this. Practiced? They had practiced for situations like this. This wasn't a child reacting emotionally to unfair treatment. This was a child who had been trained, prepared, educated in how to document discrimination and report it through proper channels. This was a father who had loved his daughter enough to teach her not just to endure injustice, but to fight it with facts, with evidence, with a kind of systematic approach that couldn't be dismissed or denied. Zahra's voice was absolutely steady when she replied, "Yes, Daddy." Veronica felt her knees weaken. She actually had to reach out and touch the headrest of seat 2C to steady herself. Around the cabin, passengers who had been watching with curiosity now stared with something closer to awe. This wasn't just a complaint. This wasn't just a child telling her father about a bad experience. This was about to become an official report delivered directly to the CEO of the airline while they were still in flight. A new voice came through Zahra's phone, and even through the small speaker, it carried the unmistakable weight of authority and barely controlled panic. "Hello, Zahra. This is Richard Castellanos. Your father tells me you've experienced some problems on one of our flights. I want you to know that I take any complaint about our service very seriously, but especially when it involves potential discrimination. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Please don't leave anything out." His tone was carefully modulated, friendly but professional, concerned but not patronizing. This was a man who understood that he was being recorded, that every word he said right now would matter, and that the person on the other end of this call was the daughter of someone important enough to have his personal number. Zahra took a breath. Then, with the same calm, clear voice she'd used throughout this entire ordeal, she began to recount the flight. Not with emotion. Not with exaggeration. Not with childish hyperbole. But with facts. Cold, hard, documented facts delivered in chronological order with a kind of systematic precision that would hold up in any investigation, any inquiry, any legal proceeding. She started with boarding at Lagos International Airport. She described how Veronica had checked Kofi Mensah's boarding pass twice, questioning him about whether he was certain he was in the right seat, suggesting that economy boarding would begin soon and those seats were in the back. She noted the time, 14:37 local time. She described how, moments later, Gerald Pemberton had boarded and Veronica had greeted him warmly by name without requesting his boarding pass at all. She described the newlyweds, Aisha and Ibrahim Diallo. How they had presented their boarding passes and Veronica had found a small printing smudge, barely noticeable, and had insisted on verifying their tickets with the gate agent. How she had made them wait for 15 minutes while other passengers, white passengers, Asian passengers, Arab passengers, had walked past them without any secondary verification. How they had stood there, their excitement visibly draining, while curious eyes watched and judged. She noted the time they were finally allowed to board, 14:52, a full 15 minutes after their passes had been presented. She described the comment Veronica had made to another flight attendant, spoken just loudly enough for the couple to hear, "I don't know how they afforded these seats." She repeated the words exactly with no embellishment, letting them speak for themselves. She moved on to her own boarding experience. How Veronica had questioned whether she was in the right seat. How she had been asked inappropriate questions about what her father did for a living. How Veronica had insisted on calling the gate to verify her ticket despite the boarding pass being perfectly valid. She noted the time, 14:55. She described the meal service, detailing how Veronica had presented multiple options to Gerald Pemberton with warmth and attentiveness, asking his preference, offering wine pairings. How she had been more perfunctory with Yuki Tanaka. How she had simply placed a meal in front of Kofi without asking his preference, despite the fact that he had pre-selected a vegetarian option that was clearly marked in the system. How Veronica had sighed with obvious annoyance when Kofi pointed this out, had made him wait while she served other passengers, and had eventually brought his correct meal without apology. She noted the time, 17:23. She described the identical situation with Aisha, who had also pre-selected a vegetarian meal and had also been ignored, had also been made to wait, had also received her correct meal last and without apology. She described the bathroom incident with painful clarity. How Aisha had walked toward the first-class lavatory and Veronica had physically blocked her path, directing her to the economy bathrooms. How Aisha had explained she was a first-class passenger in seat 3C. How Veronica had continued to insist, creating a scene that had drawn the attention of the entire cabin. How Aisha had finally been allowed to use the bathroom only after her husband had intervened. She noted the time, 19:41. And finally, she described the reading light incident. How Kofi had pressed his call button because his overhead light had stopped working entirely. How Veronica had dismissed his request, saying she wasn't maintenance and he would have to manage without it. How, exactly 5 minutes later, Gerald Pemberton had pressed his call button because his light was slightly dim. How Veronica had immediately responded with concern, had troubleshot the light, and had then retrieved a portable LED lamp from storage. A lamp that apparently existed and was available but somehow hadn't been an option for Kofi. She noted both times, 22:14 for Kofi's call, 22:19 for Gerald's call. As Zahra spoke, laying out this damning timeline of differential treatment, Veronica's face underwent a complete transformation. The blood had drained so completely that her lips looked almost blue. Her hands were shaking. She had stopped leaning against the headrest and had actually sunk down into a crouch, one hand on the armrest of seat 2C to keep herself from falling. Around the cabin, passengers listened with a mixture of shame and vindication. Those who had witnessed these incidents and said nothing, Gerald with his preferential treatment, Yuki with her silence, the businessman in 5A who had watched it all unfold, felt the weight of their complicity. Those who had experienced the discrimination, Kofi with his quiet dignity, Aisha with her tears, Ibrahim with his protective anger, felt the profound relief of being seen, of having someone finally name what had been happening, of having their reality validated instead of dismissed. When Zahra finished, there was a long, heavy silence. Then Richard Castellanos spoke, and his voice had gone from carefully modulated concern to something harder, sharper, edged with the kind of fury that comes from realizing that something terrible has happened under your leadership and you're only now learning about it. Zahra, thank you for that detailed report. I want you to know that what you've described is absolutely unacceptable and contradicts everything Transcontinental Airways stands for. Your father has shared some additional context with me that makes this situation even more serious, and I assure you that we will be taking immediate action. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had an edge of steel. Is Miss Hawthorn standing there with you now? Yes, sir. I need you to hand the phone to her, please. Zahra looked at Veronica, who was still crouched beside the seat, shaking so badly she could barely stand. The little girl held out the phone, and Veronica took it with a trembling hand that could barely grip the device. She raised it to her ear with the slow, mechanical movements of someone walking toward their own execution. She turned slightly away from the cabin, a futile attempt at privacy, but in the dead silence everyone could hear her side of the conversation even if they couldn't hear Richard Castellanos' words. This is Veronica Hawthorn. Her voice was barely above a whisper, All the earlier confidence and condescension completely evaporated. The passengers couldn't hear what Richard Castellanos was saying, but they could see Veronica's reaction to every word. They saw her eyes widen with shock. They saw her free hand come up to cover her mouth. They saw her shoulders start to shake. They saw tears begin to stream down her face, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup, turning her mascara into dark rivers down her cheeks. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice breaking. "I understand." "Yes." "No, She stopped, listening to whatever he was saying. "Yes, sir. I understand completely. Right away." "Yes." She lowered the phone from her ear and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. Then, with movements that seemed to require enormous effort, she walked the few steps back to where Zahra sat and handed the phone back with both hands, as if it were something precious and dangerous. Chukwuemeka's voice came back on the line, warm and paternal again now that the business was concluded. "Zahra, are you okay? Do you feel safe?" "Yes, Daddy. Mr. Castellanos has explained to Ms. Hawthorn what's going to happen next. You'll have different flight attendants serving your section for the remainder of the flight. When you land, there will be airline representatives waiting to make sure you get to Grandma safely and to gather any additional information you want to provide. I'm so proud of you, baby. You saw something wrong and you spoke up. That took courage. Never lose that." "I learned from the best," Zahra said, and for the first time she smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed her face from solemnly determined to simply 8 years old again. "I love you. Call me when you land so I know you're safe." "I love you too, Daddy." She ended the call and looked up at Veronica, who was now openly sobbing, mascara-stained tears dripping onto her perfectly pressed uniform. The flight attendant who had spent the entire flight treating passengers with condescension and discrimination now stood broken, her 18-year career crumbling around her in real time. Veronica's voice cracked, barely audible. "I owe you all an apology." But Zahra shook her head, her expression serious again. "Not to me. To them." She gestured toward the other passengers, to Kofi in 2A, sitting up straight now with something like wonder on his face. To Aisha and Ibrahim in 3C and 3D, holding hands tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. To all the passengers who had witnessed or experienced her discrimination throughout this flight. Veronica turned to face the cabin. 16 pairs of eyes stared back at her. There was nowhere to hide. No way to deny what had happened. No way to deflect or make excuses or explain it away as a misunderstanding. The CEO of her company had just heard a detailed account of her behavior from the daughter of one of the airline's most important business partners. Her career was over. Her professional reputation was destroyed. Everything she had built over 18 years had collapsed in less than 10 minutes because she had underestimated a child. Because she had let her prejudices guide her actions. Because she had assumed that certain people didn't belong in first class and had treated them accordingly. And now she had to face them. She began, then had to stop and swallow hard, her throat tight with tears. "I apologize. To all of you. I was unprofessional. I made assumptions I had no right to make. I treated some of you differently based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had, or maybe I did realize them but I told myself they were something else. Something more acceptable. But they weren't. They were just racism. And I'm deeply, deeply sorry." The words hung in the air, inadequate and hollow, but at least they had been said. At least the truth had been spoken aloud. She turned specifically to Kofi. "Mr. Mensah, I apologize for questioning your boarding pass multiple times when it was perfectly valid. I apologize for not bringing you a portable lamp when yours broke. I apologize for making assumptions about whether you belonged in this cabin. You did nothing to deserve that treatment." Kofi nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. After a long moment he spoke, his voice measured. "Thank you for the apology. But you should know, I've been flying this route monthly for 5 years. I'm a successful businessman. I have a master's degree from the University of London. I have 3 children who I'm raising to believe that their race shouldn't determine how they're treated. And every time I encounter what happened today, I have to go home and explain to them why the world still works this way in 2024. Your apology is noted, but it doesn't erase the fact that this happened. Again." Veronica nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and turned to Aisha and Ibrahim. "Mr. and Mrs. Diallo, I apologize for making you wait during boarding while I verified your tickets unnecessarily. I apologize for the comment I made about affordability, that was inexcusable. I apologize for directing you away from the first-class lavatory. This should have been a joyful flight for your honeymoon, and I tainted that. I'm truly sorry." Aisha couldn't speak, she was crying too hard, relief and vindication and lingering hurt all mixed together. But Ibrahim spoke for both of them, his voice tight with controlled emotion. We saved for months to afford these seats. We wanted our honeymoon to be special. And you made us feel like criminals for 15 minutes just for having the audacity to be black and in first class. Your apology doesn't give us back the joy you took from us today. But it's something. Thank you for at least saying it. Veronica turned to Zahra last. The little girl looked up at her with those steady, knowing eyes, and Veronica felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd underestimated this child. She'd dismissed her. She'd tried to silence her. And in doing so, she'd made the biggest mistake of her professional life. Zahra, Veronica said, her voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for questioning your ticket, for asking inappropriate questions, for trying to dismiss your concerns. You showed more courage and integrity today than I've shown in 18 years with this airline. I hope someday you can forgive me. Zahra looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, I hope you learn from this. With that, Veronica turned and walked toward the galley, her shoulders shaking with sobs, her professional composure completely shattered. As she disappeared behind the galley curtain, another flight attendant, Marcus, who had been in the back of first class during most of these incidents and had heard everything, emerged to check on the cabin. Marcus was a 40-year-old black man who had been with Transcontinental for 12 years. He had witnessed some of Veronica's behavior over the years but had never felt empowered to call it out, had never known quite how to address it without risking his own career. Now he approached Zahra with an expression that mixed respect, gratitude and something like awe. Miss Okonkwo, he said gently, is there anything you need? Anything at all? No thank you, Zahra said politely. I'm fine now. Marcus nodded, then addressed the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. We'll be landing in New York in approximately 3 hours. If anyone needs anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. And I want to personally thank you all for your patience during this situation. As he moved away to check on other passengers, something remarkable began to happen in that cabin. Gerald Pemberton, the white executive who had enjoyed preferential treatment throughout the flight while watching others be discriminated against, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He straightened his expensive suit jacket, took a breath and walked over to Kofi's seat. Excuse me, Gerald said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. My name is Gerald Pemberton. I'm in 1A. I wanted to apologize to you. I saw what was happening. I saw how you were being treated compared to how I was being treated. I knew it was wrong. And I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't want to get involved, that maybe I was misreading the situation. But I wasn't misreading anything. I saw exactly what was happening and I stayed silent because it benefited me. Because it was comfortable for me. And that was cowardly. I'm sorry. Kofi looked up at this man, this white executive with his silver hair and expensive watch, this man who had been part of the system that had privileged him while discriminating against others, and felt something shift. An apology from the person who had harmed you was one thing. But an apology from someone who had witnessed the harm and done nothing? That was something else. That was accountability of a different kind. Thank you for saying that, Kofi replied, and his voice was genuine. It takes courage to acknowledge complicity. I accept your apology. Gerald nodded, then walked to where Aisha and Ibrahim sat. I owe you both an apology as well. What happened to you during boarding, I saw it. I watched you stand there for 15 minutes while everyone else walked past. And I did nothing. I'm ashamed of that. I'm sorry. Ibrahim looked at this stranger who was acknowledging his own failure to act, and felt some of his anger dissipate. Thank you. Your apology means something. I hope next time you'll speak up in the moment, not after. I will, Gerald promised. That little girl taught me something today about courage. About using privilege for good instead of just accepting it silently. He walked over to Zahra's seat and knelt down so he was at eye level with her. Young lady, he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, thank you. You did what I should have done. You saw injustice and you acted. You didn't wait for someone else to fix it. You didn't tell yourself it wasn't your business. You stood up even though you're 8 years old, even though you were alone, even though it was scary. You have more courage and integrity than most adults I know. Than I've shown in my entire life. Thank you for teaching me that lesson. Zahra looked at him seriously. My father says that privilege means having the power to speak up without consequences. If you have that power and you don't use it, then you're choosing to side with injustice through your silence. Gerald felt those words hit him like a physical blow, landing somewhere deep in his chest and reverberating through his entire understanding of himself. This This extraordinary child had just articulated something he'd never quite allowed himself to acknowledge, that his silence had been a choice. That his comfort had come at the cost of others' dignity. That witnessing discrimination and doing nothing made him complicit in it. "Your father is absolutely right," Gerald said quietly. "I'll remember that. I promise you I will." He returned to his seat, and as he passed the portable LED reading lamp still clipped to his tray table, the lamp Veronica had brought him while refusing to help Kofi, he stopped. He unclipped it, walked back to Kofi's seat and held it out. "I believe this should have been yours in the first place," Gerald said. Kofi's eyes widened slightly. Then he accepted the lamp with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The gesture rippled through the cabin. Yuki Tanaka, who had remained quiet throughout, now stood up and approached Aisha and Ibrahim. "I'm so sorry I didn't say anything," she said softly, her voice heavily accented but clear. "In my culture we're taught not to make waves, to stay quiet. But I was wrong. I saw what happened and I should have supported you. Please accept my apology." Aisha reached out and took Yuki's hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for saying that. We all have to learn to speak up. Today showed us that." One by one, other passengers who had witnessed the discrimination, the businessman who had been recording on his phone, a Nigerian woman in 6C who had watched the boarding process, even the quiet elderly couple in 5C and 5D who had said nothing but had seen everything, approached the affected passengers to offer apologies for their silence, to acknowledge that they had witnessed injustice and failed to act. And in the middle of all this extraordinary accountability, Zahra Okonkwo returned to her seat, buckled her seatbelt, and picked up her economics textbook as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. As if she hadn't just taken down a discriminatory flight attendant with the precision of a seasoned advocate. As if she was just an 8-year-old girl reading about supply and demand curves while traveling to visit her grandmother. The cabin settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the tense, uncomfortable silence that had pervaded earlier, but something different. Something that felt almost like healing. The passengers returned to their entertainment, their books, their attempts at rest. But nobody would sleep easy. Nobody would forget what they'd witnessed. Nobody would remain unchanged by what had happened 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The remaining 3 hours of the flight passed in this new atmosphere. Marcus and the other flight attendants served the cabin with professionalism and genuine warmth, treating every passenger with equal dignity and respect. When they offered beverages, they asked everyone their preference with the same tone. When they checked on passengers, they made eye contact with everyone equally. It was how service should have been all along. In the galley, Veronica sat on the small fold-down seat, her face in her hands, her entire world collapsed around her. She'd spent 18 years building her career, working her way up from economy to first class, and she'd destroyed it all in one flight because she'd let her prejudices guide her actions. Because she'd made assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins and who didn't. Because she'd treated people differently based on the color of their skin and had convinced herself it was about professionalism, about standards, about anything other than what it actually was. Racism. The word sat heavy in her mind. She'd never thought of herself that way. She would have been horrified if someone had called her racist to her face. But sitting there in the galley, replaying every interaction from the flight, seeing herself through the clear, unflinching lens of Zahra's documented observations, she couldn't deny it anymore. She had treated black passengers differently. She had questioned their presence in first class. She had assumed they didn't belong. She had provided inferior service based on their race. And now she would pay the price for that. The Boeing 777 continued its journey across the Atlantic, carrying its passengers through the night sky toward New York. Outside the windows, the sun began to rise, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, passengers who had experienced something transformative tried to process what it all meant. Finally, after what seemed like both an eternity and no time at all, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Local time is 6:45 a.m. Current temperature is 58 degrees Fahrenheit. We should be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. The cabin stirred. Passengers closed their laptops, put away their books, returned their seats to the upright position. The familiar routine of landing preparations began. But there was an undercurrent of tension because everyone knew that landing wasn't the end of this story. It was the beginning of the next chapter. 28 minutes later, the wheels touched down on JFK's runway with a gentle bump and the roar of reverse thrusters. The plane taxied toward the gate, and as it pulled into position and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Everyone could see through the windows that this wasn't going to be a normal deplaning. There were people waiting at the gate. A lot of people. Airline management in their crisp suits. Security personnel standing by. And right at the front of the gate, a tall, elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair styled in elegant twists, wearing a beautiful purple dress, the same shade as Zahra's, and the kind of regal bearing that suggested she'd once been someone important or maybe still was. Chukwuemeka Okonkwo had received a call from her son 3 hours ago, explaining what had happened. She had immediately driven to JFK, used connections she still had from her own career as Nigeria's ambassador to the United Nations in the 1990s, and made sure she would be there when her granddaughter walked off that plane. The cabin doors opened. But instead of the usual orderly deplaning, the airline representatives came aboard first. A severe-looking woman in a dark suit approached Veronica, who emerged from the galley with red, swollen eyes and no trace of her earlier professional composure. "Ms. Hawthorn, I'm Jennifer Morrison, Regional HR Director for Transcontinental Airways. I need you to come with me." Veronica nodded wordlessly. She didn't even collect her belongings from the crew area. She simply followed Jennifer Morrison down the jetway, her 18-year career officially suspended pending a formal investigation that everyone knew would end in termination. The passengers watched her go. Some felt satisfaction. Others felt pity. But everyone felt that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Then it was the passengers' turn to deplane. As Zahra gathered her small backpack with its collection of airplane pins from destinations around the world, passengers approached her one last time. Kofi shook her small hand formally. "Young lady, your parents raised you right. Never lose that courage. Never stop speaking up when you see injustice. The world needs more people like you." "Thank you, Mr. Mensah," Zahra replied with that serious expression that made her seem far older than 8. Aisha and Ibrahim both hugged her, Aisha whispering through fresh tears, "You gave us our dignity back. We'll never forget what you did today." Even Gerald Pemberton, who had learned his own painful lesson about complicity, shook her hand. "You changed something in me today. Thank you for that." Zahra made her way off the plane, escorted by a Transcontinental Airways representative who treated her with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for VIPs. Which, in a sense, she was the daughter of a man whose company supplied $340 million worth of fuel annually to their airline. As she walked up the jetway and into the terminal, she saw her grandmother waiting. Chukwuemeka Okonkwo stood there with her arms open, and Zahra ran into them, finally allowing herself to be just a child again, safe in her grandmother's embrace. "I heard you had quite an adventure," Nkem said, holding her granddaughter close. "I just remembered what you and Daddy taught me," Zahra replied, her voice muffled against her grandmother's dress. "And what's that, my darling?" "That silence in the face of injustice is its own form of betrayal. That dignity isn't negotiable. That respect is something to expect, not beg for." Nkem pulled back to look at her granddaughter, this extraordinary child who carried such wisdom in such a small frame. "Your father and I taught you those words. But you had the courage to live them. That's all you, my love." Behind them, Kofi approached one more time. He'd been waiting, wanting to say something more, something important. "Mrs. Okonkwo," he said respectfully. "I'm Kofi Mensah. I was on that flight. I just wanted to tell you, your granddaughter did something remarkable today. Something I should have done myself but didn't have the courage for. She saw wrong and she made it right. You should be very proud." Nkem smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We are. We always have been. But thank you for telling me." As Kofi walked away to collect his luggage, Nkem looked down at Zahra. "Come on, let's get your bags and go home. I made your favorite, jollof rice and plantains." They walked toward baggage claim hand in hand, grandmother and granddaughter, looking like any other family reunion at an airport. But what they'd left behind was anything but ordinary. Because what happened next, in the hours and days and weeks that followed that flight, would ripple outward in ways that no one in that first-class cabin could have predicted. The investigation into Veronica Hawthorn's conduct was swift and thorough. When Transcontinental Airways' corporate team pulled her employment file, they found something that should have raised red flags years ago: 47 complaints about her behavior over 18 years. 47 separate incidents where passengers had reported feeling discriminated against, questioned unnecessarily, treated with suspicion or disrespect. 47 complaints, and every single one had been dismissed. Some had been explained away as misunderstandings. Others had been attributed to difficult passengers, or cultural differences, or communication issues. Some had simply been filed and forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of a massive airline dealing with thousands of customer complaints daily. Veronica had been a senior employee with an otherwise clean record. No major safety violations, no attendance issues, consistently punctual and professional in the narrow sense of showing up and doing the basic requirements of her job. So the complaints had been overlooked, filed away, ignored. Until an 8-year-old girl with gold beads in her braids had documented everything with the precision of a lawyer and had direct access to the CEO of her father's multi-billion-dollar company. The investigation revealed that Veronica Hawthorn had demonstrated a clear pattern of differential treatment based on race. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from Lagos Airport showed her interactions during boarding. The aircraft's internal systems had logged every call button press, every service request, time-stamped and cross-referenced with seat numbers. Other flight attendants, when interviewed, reluctantly confirmed that they had witnessed questionable behavior but had never felt empowered to report it. 3 days after the flight, Veronica Hawthorn's employment with Transcontinental Airways was terminated for cause. No severance package. No letter of recommendation. Just a notation in her personnel file that would follow her to any future employment in the airline industry. But Transcontinental Airways' reckoning didn't end with firing one flight attendant. Because Richard Castellanos understood that this wasn't just about one bad employee. This was about a system that had allowed 47 complaints to be dismissed. This was about a culture that had enabled discrimination to persist unchecked for 18 years. This was about an airline that claimed to value diversity and inclusion but had failed its passengers of color over and over again. And he knew that if he didn't make sweeping changes immediately, Chukwuemeka Okonkwo would simply take his $340 million fuel contract elsewhere. And probably encourage other African businesses to do the same. The financial impact alone would be devastating. But beyond that, the story was already getting out. News of what had happened on Flight T-7834 was spreading through social media, through news outlets, through the tight-knit communities of business travelers who talked to each other about which airlines treated them with respect and which didn't. Transcontinental Airways had to act decisively. Within 2 weeks, the airline had implemented mandatory anti-bias training for all flight attendants, not the perfunctory online modules that employees could click through in 20 minutes, but intensive, in-person workshops led by actual diversity and inclusion experts. 8 hours of training that made people uncomfortable, that forced them to examine their own prejudices, that taught them to recognize and interrupt discriminatory behavior. They created a new reporting system for discrimination complaints. One that went directly to a dedicated team rather than being filtered through layers of management who might dismiss or minimize concerns. Every complaint would be investigated thoroughly. Every complaint would receive a response within 48 hours. And complaints would be tracked systematically, looking for patterns that might indicate problematic employees. They established a passenger advocate position, a senior role reporting directly to the CEO's office with the authority to investigate discrimination complaints and recommend policy changes. The first person hired for this position was a black woman with 20 years of experience in civil rights law. They revised their boarding protocols to eliminate unnecessary verification requests that disproportionately targeted passengers of color. No more questioning valid boarding passes unless there was a clear, specific, articulable reason related to safety or security. No more assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins. And they did something else, something that actually mattered. They apologized. Not a generic corporate apology buried in a press release. A real apology, delivered personally to every passenger who had been on Flight TA-7834 and had witnessed or experienced discrimination. Phone calls from senior executives. Compensation that included full refunds for their tickets plus additional travel vouchers. And an invitation to participate in advisory panels that would help the airline identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. Kofi Mensah received a personal call from Richard Castellanos, who apologized for the treatment he'd received and asked him to serve on the airline's new Passenger Diversity Advisory Council. Kofi accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to create real change. Aisha and Ibrahim Diallo received a letter of apology along with vouchers for a free round-trip flight anywhere in the world, first class, for their 1-year anniversary. And an invitation to share their story with flight attendant training groups, if they felt comfortable doing so. Gerald Pemberton wrote his own letter to Transcontinental Airways, describing his experience on the flight and his own failure to speak up. He asked that his letter be used in training materials as an example of how privilege and silence enable discrimination. The airline included it in their anti-bias training program. Even Yuki Tanaka, who had felt terrible about her own silence, became part of the change. She wrote about her experience in her blog, which reached thousands of readers in Japan, starting conversations about discrimination and the responsibility to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. As for Veronica Hawthorn, she largely disappeared from public view. She issued a brief written apology through her lawyer, acknowledging her behavior and expressing regret. She entered therapy, working to understand and unpack the prejudices that had destroyed her career. It would take her years to process what had happened and her role in it. Whether she ever truly changed, whether she did the deep, difficult work of confronting and eliminating her own racism, that's a story that doesn't belong to this one. But the most remarkable outcome of Flight T-7834 wasn't what happened to the airline or the flight attendant. It was what happened to Zahra Okonkwo. The story of the 8-year-old girl who had stood up to discrimination at 37,000 feet spread rapidly. News outlets picked it up. It went viral on social media. People were inspired by this child's courage, her composure, her refusal to be silenced. Zahra's father, protective of his daughter's privacy, limited her media exposure. But he also recognized an opportunity to teach her about using her voice for broader change. Together, they created a foundation dedicated to teaching young people how to recognize and respond to discrimination. They developed curricula for schools. They funded programs that taught children about their rights as consumers, as passengers, as human beings deserving of dignity. Zahra became a youth advocate for equal treatment, speaking at schools and community centers when her father felt it was appropriate and she felt comfortable doing so. She talked about what she'd learned, that injustice doesn't care about your age. That if you can see wrong happening, you have a responsibility to speak up. That documentation matters. That staying calm and stating facts is more powerful than anger. That change is possible when people refuse to accept the unacceptable. She continued to travel, continued to collect those airplane pins from destinations around the world. But now, when she traveled, flight attendants knew who she was. And they treated everyone in their cabins with equal respect, knowing that this particular passenger was watching, documenting, unafraid to hold them accountable. On the first anniversary of Flight TA-7834, Transcontinental Airways invited Zahra and her father to their headquarters in Atlanta. They showed them all the changes that had been implemented. They introduced them to the new passenger advocate. They presented data showing that discrimination complaints had dropped by 73% since the new policies and training had been put in place. They thanked Zahra for forcing them to confront a problem they'd been ignoring for far too long. And they offered her something remarkable: a lifetime platinum membership in their frequent flyer program. Not because of who her father was. Not because of his company's fuel contract. But because an 8-year-old girl had taught a multi-billion-dollar corporation about accountability, about dignity, about the kind of service that everyone deserves regardless of the color of their skin. Years later, when Zahra Okonkwo was grown, when she graduated from university and started her own advocacy organization and become the kind of powerful voice for change that her father always knew she would be, people would ask her about that flight. About what made her stand up when so many adults had stayed silent. About where she found the courage to confront injustice at such a young age. And she would always give the same answer: my father taught me that dignity isn't negotiable. That respect isn't something to beg for but something to expect. That silence in the face of injustice is its own form of betrayal. He didn't just teach me those words, he taught me to live them. And when you truly believe that every person deserves dignity, speaking up isn't courageous. It's just necessary. So let me leave you with this. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most power. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unlikely teachers. Sometimes justice arrives not through the expected channels of authority and bureaucracy, but through the clear eyes and brave heart of a child who simply knows right from wrong and refuses to accept anything less. Zahra Okonkwo understood something that day at 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean that many adults spend their whole lives failing to grasp. That dignity isn't given, it's claimed. That respect isn't a privilege reserved for some, it's a right that belongs to all. That when you witness wrong and do nothing, you become part of the wrong. And that power without accountability is just tyranny dressed in a uniform. On that flight, an 8-year-old girl reminded everyone in that first-class cabin, and eventually, everyone who heard her story, that change doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It doesn't wait for someone else to act first. Change happens when one person decides that enough is enough. When one person refuses to be silent. When one person stands up and says, "This is wrong and I will not accept it." That person can be anyone. Any age. Any background. Any walk of life. That person can be you. So here's my question for you. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent because it felt safer, more comfortable, less complicated than speaking up? Have you ever watched someone be treated unfairly and told yourself it wasn't your place to get involved? Have you ever benefited from a system that disadvantages others and simply accepted that benefit without questioning it? What would you have done if you were on that flight? Would you have been Zahra, documenting and confronting? Would you have been Gerald, eventually apologizing for your silence? Would you have been Kofi, maintaining quiet dignity while enduring disrespect? Or would you have been one of the many passengers who simply looked away? Think about that. Sit with that question. Because we all face those moments, maybe not on flights, maybe not in ways as dramatic as this story, but in our daily lives. At work, at school, in stores, in restaurants. We see people being treated differently, unfairly, disrespectfully. And we make choices about whether to speak up or stay silent. Zahra's story is a reminder that speaking up matters. That one voice can create change. That courage doesn't require being an adult or having power or waiting for permission. It just requires seeing wrong and refusing to accept it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it inspired you to be braver the next time you witness injustice, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss stories like this. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories about courage in the face of adversity. Stories that remind us what's possible when we refuse to accept the unacceptable. Because these stories, they're not just entertainment. They're roadmaps. They're lessons. They're proof that one person really can make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see something wrong, you'll remember Zahra Okonkwo, 8 years old with gold beads in her braids, standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin and refusing to be silent. And maybe you'll find your own courage to do the same.